Hey guys. So I'm at home with my baby girl because she's sick. And one of the things I wanted to do is to just make sure we have a hold of chapter 15 because we are still going to test. Okay. Nothing's going to derail the chapter 15-16 test. We do have some wiggle room in December, of course. Today's the first day of December. I can't believe it. Um, for our essay boot camp, so we should be okay. So I'm going to try to get through as much as I can with chapter 15. Please, if you haven't done all the Edpuzzle videos that I've already posted, that I actually have started doing that now for all the chapters. It's really going to help you get background information as a good foundation, because Heimler and Joe's Productions, they're not going to go through the intricacies that I'm going to go through, but they're definitely going to have like a basis that is going to form just great thinking for y'all. So on Tuesday or Monday, on Tuesday, we went through the first part of Reconstruction, right? And we find ourselves kind of in this idea of, how do we think through Reconstruction? We've got problems we have to solve. Who's going to solve these problems? And like, what's the reaction going on? So problem number one, again, is how are these states coming back in? And we see that with Lincoln proposing the 10% plan. Well, remember, like, how did Congress feel about that? Well, they respond with the Wade Davis bill. And I have that right here. And Lincoln's like, ugh, I don't like that. I'm going to pocket veto it. Right. Now, again, I talked about all of this stuff on Tuesday. And before we can even try to solve Reconstruction, we're debating if we're a year about what's better. Is it the 10% plan or is it the Wade Davis bill? And all of a sudden, Lincoln's assassinated. So phase two, Reconstruction, Johnson's president, and he shares his restoration plan. And in his plan, he's ready to, ratify the 13th Amendment for states to come back in. But slowly and surely, he's allowing former CSA leaders to serve as delegates. Okay. Now, can I just mention, I have my test out while I'm doing this lecture, and I'm really focusing on the test questions, especially because I've been out for 2 days. So please understand that if Johnson's allowing delegates, former CSA delegates, to serve to ratify the 13th Amendment, he's opening a door, right? And all of a sudden, we're acquiring these baby steps to get Democrats back in control of the South, which will eventually happen at the end of the chapter. But this is kind of that like springboard motion. Okay. And the Southern states combat the ratification of the 13th Amendment with black codes. And we talked about that on Tuesday. And then Congress comes in and passes Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And Johnson sees both of these. He doesn't like him. What does he do to both of them? He vetoes these. And what does Congress do in response? Well, they override the vetoes, right? So conflict is ensuing. Congress responds with amending the Constitution with the 14th Amendment. And then to stick it to Johnson, they go ahead and impeach him and then move troops into the South in the Restoration Act of 1867. Okay. So that's what we covered on Tuesday. So let me kind of fly through this. And I should have ended on this slide for mostly all my classes. Some of you guys, we got to the election of 1868. Sometimes we didn't. But one of the big things I want y'all to see here is after the Reconstruction Act of 1867, again, we've got military districts being separated in the South. Troops are down there to do what? Enforce the law. Can we count on Johnson to do that? No, we cannot. Okay. So the impeachment proceedings move on, and I'm only testing you on what impeachment has been used for in American history. We're not kicking out presidents. All of them are politically motivated, and it destroys power and it destroys authority. And this is what it's going to do for Johnson. Okay. So in the election of 1868, Johnson's definitely not going up for re-election. But the House and the Senate are pushing for the 15th Amendment. At the same time, Grant, the hero of the American Civil War, is elected. Okay. So you've got like a double whammy. You've got Congress continuously affecting the Constitution. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments will all be ratified within a very short period of time. And it's to bring as much fairness and equality as we can to freedmen in the South. And it's going to cause a little bit of a stir, this 15th Amendment. And I didn't get to this on Tuesday, but I've been to get to it now. The 15th Amendment is allowing the voting for Black men. Okay. Now, there's a group of people that have kind of been fighting for suffrage for a long time. And I've been talking about them since the Benevolent Empire. in the first industrial revolution around the 1820s. And then they had this big moment in 1848 known as Seneca Falls, but nobody cared and nobody's paying attention. And all of a sudden we have these amazing reforms going on to move our country in a big direction, and women aren't mentioned in the amendment, and it's going to do a lot of bad things. It's actually going to cause a split, and women's suffrage is denied. And all of a sudden, you've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony creating the National Women's Suffrage Association. They're saying no to the 15th Amendment. Then you get the American Women's Suffrage Association. And in the American Women's Suffrage Association, they're saying, well, y'all, this is kind of a good thing. Why don't we just use this as a springboard? Like, why are we hating? Why can't we kind of come together and say that, this might be a good idea, and let's fight suffrage on a state level, right? The American Women's Suffrage Association is like, well, let's do it state by state. Let's see how we can conquer in small volumes. And they're actually really successful. Okay. So you're going to have a test on this. Most women are going to favor the American Women's Suffrage Association. You're going to need to know that for your test. And you're going to need to know the difference between the two. So please make sure you know that. And you need to know on what side Elizabeth is on. She and Susan create the National Women's Suffrage Association in response to the 15th Amendment. So again, Reconstruction is just building on. We have a hero in the White House. And one of the first actions that Elizabeth does is she goes to the United States Supreme Court. And we get the decision of Minor versus Happersett, which basically means just because you're a citizen, that doesn't mean you have the right to vote. And she was trying to use the verbiage in the 15th Amendment to extend suffrage to everybody. We needed that one word in the amendment. We needed the word sex to just determine male and female and allow women the right to vote. Unfortunately, ladies, we just didn't get it yet. But the American American Women Suffrage Association is going to be working at the state level, and they're actually going to have a lot of success. Most states are actually going to extend suffrage to women before the 19th Amendment. So as much as Elizabeth is disheartened and just very upset, they call her a racist. They're really, she's really upset, and people are upset with her. And Reconstruction is all of a sudden having a little bit more conflict than reconciliation. Okay. As you can see here, women are left out in the cold. And you also see a Chinese immigrant off to the left there. I'm not putting that in the chapter 15. That's going to go in chapter 16, but there's a lot of nuance of events going on. We're just going to stick with Reconstruction for right now. Okay, so what does the meaning of freedom really constitute? Where are we at? And this is probably what I would have talked about yesterday when I was out. We need to have a couple of reality checks here. One of the biggest things that's going to keep freedmen in this endless cycle of debt and not being able to obtain true freedom is, what are they going to do for a living? What does freedom really look like, right? Freedom is economic freedom, right? It's ideological, it's religious. There's a lot of ways to assume it. But we're having a big standstill on what Northerners want versus what Southerners want, because the South isn't changing, y'all. It's an agricultural based society. That's not going to change. And you have millions of people who are now citizens, who now have the right to vote, and who need a voice in how government is rendered. But also, how are they going to make money? How are they going to pay for their children, for shelter? What's going to happen? Well, their skill set surrounds agriculture. And in the beginning, you're going to see lots of contracts being drawn up through the black codes that are very, very unfair. Congress comes in and destroys black codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And now we need ideas. Republicans, they don't want to confiscate land because, again, they don't want to continue any issues with property, right? Property has always been protected in the Constitution. And now that slavery is abolished, we can uphold property. But the problem is, well, how are we going to find land for these people? Because black codes were also keeping former slaves from getting loans. How are you going to get land? How are you going to get anything if you can't go to the bank and get loans? Well, Johnson's plan is maintaining land rights to ex-Confederates. So there's no land to be had. If there is any land, nobody can go to a bank to get a loan in order to get the land. We're kind of at a standstill. So the idea to solve all our problems is sharecropping. That was a lot of context to sharecropping, but it's probably one of the single most important things to the failure of Reconstruction, which is kind of how I'm like meandering this lecture today. Okay, it's an exchange of labor for land, house, tools, things, because there's no equity, there's no capital. Slaves don't have any wealth, so if they want to do the only thing they know how to do, they're going to be paid laborers. Essentially, is what's going on. But they want some sort of sense of ownership. Okay. But they're not going to be able to compete with anybody, which makes it incredibly difficult. Sharecropping is going to cause this like insane cycle of debt. By the time they pay back a portion of their profits back to their former slave owners, in many cases, right? They're not going to be able to compete with the large scale farmers. So you're basically in this, again, you're in this endless cycle of debt. Has slavery really changed? Well, no, not with sharecropping. Not with sharecropping. The 13th Amendment's changed. 14th Amendment's passed. 15th Amendment is passed. Civil Rights Act is passed. Freedmen's Bureau is passed. You're going to start to see more and more African Americans starting to run for government office. You know, Republicans in the South are voting for Grant. I mean, things are moving in the right direction. But when we really look at the day-to-day life, slavery hasn't ended. And sharecropping is a huge example of that. Because freedom needs to look like economic freedom, y'all. Okay. So cotton prices are declining in the 1870s, and sharecroppers are just trapped in debt. Okay. So sharecropping might have sounded like a good idea on paper, but once it's practiced, even in the midst of all of this, you know, we got a Republican in office, things are going our way, Johnson is gone. Are we really doing the things we need to do to help these people? The answer is no, we're not. So you can see here in our maps, 1860 versus 1881. Sharecropping is expanding houses of former slaves. So their houses were all together, and now they're just spread out, and they're taking different pieces of land. They're borrowing seeds, they're borrowing the tools, they're borrowing everything that they need from their former slave owners to grow the crop. And they're giving parts of their crop yield back to their former slave owners in order to pay for the things they needed to grow it. And then the rest they can can take to market, but their prices, they can't compete, right? They can't bring it to the market the way the others can, and they're just caught in this endless cycle of debt, especially when we get to the 1870s, when we have this awful depression. Okay, other things that we're starting to see after rejoining the Union. What do the state governments look like? Well, let's not forget that Johnson's allowing former CSA leaders to serve as delegates on the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and it kind of opens this door to what state government's going to do. One of the first things they do is pass black codes. Now, what are historians saying about these governments? Well, a lot of them are saying they're corrupt and ignorant, right? Using ideas like convict leasing. I quizzed you guys on convict leasing. It was not successful in any way. And then some historians are saying, well, they were progressive reformers of education, family law, social services, commerce. And that was the success, the only success of the Freedmen's Bureau. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a duality of truth, right? We love that in APUSH because that's not the hardest thing that we talk about in this class. The answer is yes, they're both true. You're seeing the downfall and the potential end of Reconstruction at the same time that we are taking baby steps. And we do need to recognize the baby steps. All in all, Reconstruction will be a favor. But if you do talk to the minor changes, right, that's how you get those points on an essay. That's how you really start to appeal to AP graders, because they recognize the whole truth, but they are starting to see the story that will be told in the 100 years it's going to take to solve our problem of Reconstruction. Another positive light would be the Union League, if you wanted to drop that as a key term, which is, you know, groups of Republicans that are they're teaming up together. You got white and black coming together and explaining the electoral process to, you know, ignorant voters, people, and this is poor whites and this is freedmen, trying to get them to understand like how they can maintain power in politics and how they can use our government structure to their benefit, which is great. And then we've got another couple of groups of people. You got your scallywags. These are Southern whites who are supporting Reconstruction. They're kind of looked at as traitors. Okay. Then you have your carpetbaggers. You got people coming down South, right, to take opportunity out of, the government dollars that are coming down south. And they're going to do pretty well. So how are Southerners going to perceive them? Well, a lot of Southerners are going to perceive them as corrupt, right? And again, it's a lot of duality of truth. We have troops in the South implementing as much Reconstruction as humanly possible in the existence of Black codes that should be illegal, right? In the existence of former CSA leadership winning back state government, right? And Heimler does a great job of describing this. Like, this is what's going on while the troops are in the South. Like, what happens when they're taken away, right? It's going to get 10 times as worse. So the South is kind of hanging on just a little bit with hope, trying to move in the right direction in the midst of things like sharecropping that's just not effective, in the midst of things like, convict leasing, which is completely ridiculous. People coming down, try to taking advantage. And then you've got people within their own communities looking at each other as traitors, right? This is a lot. And it's just this duality of truth that's existing. Okay. Building Black communities, as we saw in the map, again, family and faith is always going to be the bedrock of African-American community in this period of time. So schools are a huge part of this in the Freedmen's Bureau. The only successful part of Freedmen's Bureau and of Reconstruction is the school systems that are finally brought down to the Deep South. Segregated, yes, but at least we have public education. So again, what's this duality of truth? We've got a lot of work. We have to reconcile our differences, but you're talking about trying to reconcile a society that is not convinced that races are equal. And it's a really difficult concept for them. It's going to take 100 years, right, to solve that problem. In the midst, you're fighting for community leadership in the Black church. You're fighting to build schools. You're fighting for the Civil Rights Act and try to get race uplift, right? You want to desegregate public transit and hotels and churches. So Congress sees this segregation going on. They see Reconstruction kind of like falling through their fingertips, and they pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, all aspects of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 are on your test. So we need to go through these. Number one, full and equal access to jury service. Number two, desegregated transportation, desegregated public accommodations, irrespective of race, right? And the last piece, this is the last piece of congressional action of the era. We're going to kind of shift gears as we get into the third section of Reconstruction and just talk about the downfall of the Republican Party. And that's really big with the undoing of Reconstruction. So I'm just going to kind of skip through here. These are the things we're going to cover when I get back on Monday. Okay. I didn't want this lecture to be too long. So we're going to kind of finish Reconstruction on Monday. And we might have to battle through chapter 16. I might have to test you on the Monday after next, but that's okay. But I didn't want to show you these electoral college maps. This is the election of 1868. This is Grant's first election. And look at these Republican states. Now, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia have yet to ratify the amendments in order to get back into the Union. Their state governments are working on that. But look at all these Republicans coming out in the election. Southern states voting Republican. And you can see it in Grant's second election as well, right? And then we're going to get to the election of 76 and things are going to change. So I'm going to stop right here. And on Monday, I'm going to pick up with the undoing of Reconstruction. But it's just like a synopsis. I want you guys to start to see, like, slowly but surely the efforts made are great. There's this idea that radical Republicans have in trying to change things for the better. But in the end, ideas aren't working out so much, like sharecropping. Okay. Civil Rights Act of 1875. This is an amazing idea. This is great. But what we're also going to see in this period of time is the Democrats are going to win back the House of Representatives. Radical Republicans are going to lose their power, and we need to figure out why. And on Monday, it's really going to come down to failed government policy and an economic depression and tons of scandal. No one's going to trust the Republican government anymore. And everyone's going to be sick of government. Everyone's going to be sick of Reconstruction. They want to move on. And the second industrial revolution is on its way. And all of a sudden, Reconstruction is not going to be on anyone's minds. And we are going to be leaving whole groups of people in parts of the South to kind of just to be left where they started. Slavery really isn't ending with sharecropping. Democrats are assuming power, especially after the troops are going to get pulled out of the South. And I'll go more in depth with that. So you got a lot of efforts being made, but the way in which things are rendered, you're not going to have a lot of success. And I'm hitting this hard because this is it's a great opportunity for College Board to try to trick you on an essay, right? Like, talk about the change that occurred during Reconstruction. Well, was there? Yeah, there's all these things happening. We've got the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. This should have completely changed the landscape of the United States. But did it? No. And why? Like all of these key terms that I mentioned today and that I'm going to talk about on Monday. Okay. So Monday, chapter 16, key terms are still due. I'm going to finish up chapter 15 and then we're going to move through chapter 16 next week. If we have to move the test, we can move the test. It's not the end of the world. Y'all have a great weekend. Remember, discipline over motivation. Always.